Hello students, in the part 1 of environment and ecology, what you have learnt is the science part of it. A part from where you get a lot of prelims questions over the years if you look at the previous year papers, and a part where you need the basic understanding of the subject very well. Now, in the second part, what we are going to do is slightly a more factual unit of environment and ecology, starting with the international conferences, where we'll study all about all the conferences and all the protocols and all the conventions that have happened over the years, starting from the very first, that is Stockholm Convention, and going up to the very last one, that is the Kigali Agreement. So all these things we'll discuss here. We'll go year by year as and when they happened, what were the basic agenda of them, what were the main objectives of it, and what were the outcomes that came out of all these conventions, protocols or conferences. So we'll discuss all these areas in this unit. After that, in the second unit, what we are going to do is look at all the legislations and the acts that have come across in India and in the world over the years. So slightly factual portion related to the environment part, nevertheless a very important one, because over the years, again, this has been one area, especially if you go to the question papers of 2016 and 17, you will see that a lot of questions have come from these two areas. So we'll discuss each and every one of them. We'll look into the objectives, we'll look into the outcomes of each and every of the conference, protocols and conventions. And after that, in the second chapter, we'll look into all the acts and legislatures that have come with respect to environment. So these two fairly factual portion, as I said, so that's why the notes have been made available. Please contact the mentorship team and get hold of these notes so that you don't have to write each and everything that comes out on the screen. I have mentioned all the important points related to these areas in those notes. Please get a hold of the notes. So let's start with the first chapter, that is international conferences, protocols and conventions. So what do we mean by a conference? A conference basically is one set of negotiations where you will have only one broad theme. So in the conference, the principal bodies are established for further deliberations. That is the main importance of a conference. Then apart from that, the next one that you talk of are conventions. So what do we mean by a convention? So if I speak about convention, it is a meeting or a gathering to formulate or deliberate on a generally accepted principle, a framework in which the parties decide the basic guidelines. So this is what will happen in a convention. So sometimes the line between a conference and a convention is very thin, and sometimes they are actually used interchangeably also, because the outcome of the document of a convention is arrived at a conference. So that's why many a times you'll see that these two terms are used interchangeably. Now apart from that, you have something called as protocols. So protocol to a convention is an agreement that diplomatic negotiations formulate and sign as a basis for final convention where the parties set specific aims or legal obligations. So usually when a major provision is to be incorporated on regulations of the convention, then a protocol is called among the countries who are signatories of the original convention when it was signed and approved. So this is what happens, or these are few terms that you should know before we go to the chapter, because everywhere you'll see either a conference or a protocol or a conference happening. So you should just know the brief about what these terms mean. Now talking about the conferences with respect to environmental issues, the very first one that was formulated was the Stockholm Declaration. And when it comes to Stockholm Declaration, the first thing, the name was United Nations Conference on Human Environment. It was held in 1972 at Stockholm and was the first declaration of international protection of the environment. So that's why this becomes so important. There were 113 countries, including India, that participated and accepted the declaration. Many of the environmental acts, many of the air and water acts that were made in India in 1980s were a direct result of the Stockholm Declaration. So the Stockholm Declaration contained 26 principles, and these principles provide the basis for an international policy for protection and improvement of the environment. So no need to know what these 26 principles are, but what you need to know are the objectives. So that's why that's important. Now, the United Nations Environment Program, which was established by the United Nations General Assembly, was actually a direct result of the Stockholm Conference. So that's why the UNEP was basically established after the Stockholm Declaration. Then after that, the next one that we had was Convention on Migratory Species, popularly known as the BONN Convention. So when it comes to the BONN Convention, it aimed to conserve the terrestrial, marine and avian migratory species throughout their range. The convention facilitated the adoption of a strict protected measure for endangered migratory species, the conclusion of multilateral agreements for the conservation and management of migratory species, and cooperative research activities. So all these were the main objectives of the BONN Convention. Mainly, key word here is migratory species. Now, one more thing about this convention that you should know, that it has two appendices. Why I have mentioned these appendices is because if you go to the past papers of UPSC, you will see that sometimes they mention the appendix of an international conference that happens, and they ask a question from there. They have done this for WTO in the past. So there is a possibility that you get a question from here. So what are the two appendix? First, appendix 1. So appendix 1 lists the migratory species that are classified as endangered and where urgent international cooperation is necessary to address the issue. And then the second one lists other species that require or would benefit significantly from international agreements under the convention. So in 1983, this convention entered into force, and with respect to India, if you talk about, then marine turtles and Siberian cranes, the dugong, all these are the parts of this convention, and that's why the conservation efforts that are being undertaken actually can be said to be a direct result of the BONN Convention. Then after that, we had the Nairobi Declaration. Now, Nairobi Declaration marked 10 years of Stockholm Declaration. So that's why it was a significant year. So it was adopted at Nairobi, and basically where we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration. Now, what was the main objective of the Nairobi Declaration? It envisaged the creation of a special commission to frame long-term environmental strategies for achieving sustainable development up to the year 2000 and beyond. So this was the main objective, and for the first time we come to hear about the word sustainable development. Until that point we were not mentioning this term. Then after that, we had the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer, 1985, and a direct result of this was Montreal Protocol. Now this convention was adopted on 22nd March 1985, and after that it came into force on 22nd September 1988. So, and in 2009, Vienna Convention became the first convention of any kind to achieve universal ratification. So a very, very important point. Now, when you talk about the objective of the convention were for the parties to promote cooperation by means of systematic observations, research and information exchange on the efforts of human activities on the ozone layer, and to adopt legislative or administrative measures against the activities likely to have effects on the ozone layer. So, a direct result of the Vienna Convention was the Montreal Protocol. The Vienna Convention did not require the countries to take concrete actions to control ozone depleting substances, or many a times also called as ODS. And finally, the countries agreed that whatever comes out of the Montreal Protocol, they would adhere to it. Now, the next one was direct, as I said, a direct result of the Vienna Convention. It was Montreal Protocol. So, it was designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the production of a number of ozone depleting substances such as chlorofluorocarbons. So, all the efforts against the substances that cause a problem in the ozone layer were taken here, and all the member countries started to act against all these kind of substances in the coming years. Now, one more thing that you should note here is that the ozone depleting substances contain either chlorine or bromine. Now, when we are talking about chlorofluorocarbons, there is also fluorine. So, one thing that you need to remember here, and this can become an important point from prelims point of view, is that fluorine, if present independently, does not cause any problem in the atmosphere or to the ozone layer. But if it is present in combination with any other of such halogens, then in that case that becomes a problem. So that is the thing, and that's what I have written here, that substances containing fluorine only do not harm the ozone layer. Now one major significance that we have for Montreal Protocol is the fact that in a major innovation to the protocol, it recognized that all the nations should not be treated equally. The agreement acknowledges that certain countries have contributed to the ozone depletion more than others. And at the same time, it also recognized that a nation's obligation to reduce current emission should reflect its technological and financial ability to do so. Then, apart from that, it successfully phased out the ozone depleting substances, and the ozone layer was on the path to full recovery. And if you look at the data for the previous few years, you will see that there has been a shift in the ozone layer, and the ozone layer has started to fill in again. Now, there was one problem that happened because of the Montreal Protocol, and this was the fact that it led to a shift towards hydrofluorocarbons. So instead of chlorofluorocarbons, the companies or the commerces started to use hydrofluorocarbons. So the problem is, like the ozone depleting substances, hydrofluorocarbons are potent greenhouse gases that can be hundreds to thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide in contributing to climate change. And this became very problematic situation, and hydrofluorocarbons are actually the fastest growing greenhouse gas emission. So that's what actually led to something called as the Kigali Agreement. Now the Kigali Agreement basically aimed to amend the Montreal Protocol and substantially limit the emissions of the hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs. Now, because what was felt was that without a mitigation plan, the HFCs could warm the world by addition of at least a half a degree by the end of this century. So that's why it became a problematic situation. But India actually pressed for a more lenient deadline at the negotiations. Ultimately, it actually agreed to start freezing the HFCs by 2028. 4 years later than all the other, you can say, developing countries like Brazil, China and other African nations. So even in the consumption would be started to freeze by 2028. So by late 2040s, all the countries are expected to consume no more than 15 to 20% of their respective baselines. Overall, the agreement is expected to reduce the carbon or hydrofluorocarbons by 85% by 2045. So the Kigali Agreement actually provides exemptions for the countries with high ambient temperatures to phase out the hydrofluorocarbons at a slower pace. Initially, India was not ready to agree to a freezing year, but then slowly it showed flexibility and finally it accepted 2028 to be the year. The countries negotiating at the Kigali Agreement also agreed to provide adequate finance to select few countries to aid in the reduction of HFCs. The grants for research and development or providing alternatives to hydrofluorocarbons will be the most immediate priority for all these countries. So, Kigali Agreement 2016. Then after that, in 1987, we saw the Brundtland report which came out of the Brundtland Committee. So, what exactly the Brundtland Committee report means, or why it is significant, is because the concept of sustainable development was crystallized in this particular report, that is the Brundtland report. The commission that was established, that is Brundtland Commission, it drew upon long established line of thought that had developed substantially over previous 20 years. So what Brundtland Commission did was it defined what is sustainable development. And what it said is that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is called as sustainable development. The prominence that was given to needs actually reflects a concern to eradicate poverty and meet basic human needs as broadly understood. So the concept of sustainable development focused attention on finding strategies to promote economic and social development in means or in ways that avoided environmental degradation, overexploitation or pollution, and sidelines less productive debate about whether to prioritize development or the environment, so that both can be taken together. A direct result of the Brundtland Committee report was the Earth Summit of 1992. But the next one that we need to see is the 1989 Basel Convention on Control of Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Wastes and their Disposal. Now, why this was important, that by this time that the countries had started looking to clean their countries and clean their backyards, the basic line of thought for many of the developed countries was that my backyard should be clean. And this led to the fact that much of the waste were being dumped to lesser developed countries. So that's why this treaty was developed, and it became an international treaty that was designed to reduce the movement of hazardous waste between nations, specifically to prevent the transfer of hazardous waste from a developed country to a less developed country, which was named as LDCs. So it does not address. Now, one major flaw that was associated with the Basel Convention, that it does not address the movement of radioactive waste. And this is something that was criticized at the time. The convention was also intended to minimize the amount and the toxicity of waste and to assist least developed countries in environmentally sound management of the hazardous and the other wastes that they generate. So these are the important points with respect to the Basel Convention. Then after that, the most important convention that we come to is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the Earth Summit 1992. So for the first time, and again an important year because it is 20 years from the Stockholm Declaration. So now what happened is, in 1992 a major significant step was taken, known as the Rio Declaration. So in continuation to the Stockholm Declaration and the NAIROBI Declaration, the third major declaration was held at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. Now this was attended by more than 150 countries at the time, and that's why it was also called as Earth Summit at that point. It discussed global and environmental problems very widely. It was the biggest international conference in history of international relations and was also called as the Parliament of the planet at that point of time. So it became a very huge development. Now the formal process of this summit culminated into the adoption of 5 documents. And what these 5 documents are? These are Rio Declaration, Agenda 21, Legally Non-Binding Principles of Forestry, Convention on Climate Change, and Convention on Biodiversity. So again, something which can directly be asked in the prelims examination, that which of the following were not a part of the Earth Summit, or which of the following documents were not a direct result of the Earth Summit. So the very first one is Rio Declaration. Now when we talk of Rio Declaration, it was adopted in the conference recognizing the universal and integral nature of Earth, and by establishing a global partnership among states and enlisting general rights and obligations of the environmental protection. The principle placed human beings at the center of sustainable development concerns by stating that the humans are entitled to healthy and productive life in harmony with the nature. The gist of those principles are happy and healthy life to all people in the world. In order to achieve this goal, the concept of sustainable development has been established. So all these things are important when it comes to the Rio Declaration. Understand what exactly it meant. Then after that, another outcome was Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as UNFCCC. So UNFCCC is an international environmental treaty produced at the Earth Summit in 1992. The treaty aimed at reducing emissions of greenhouse gases in order to combat global warming. So each and every one of the 5 documents that we are talking of, each will have a different set of targets on which it will specifically be working on. And for UNFCCC, it was to combat or reduce the emission of greenhouse gas in order to combat global warming. So its stated objective is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration in the environment at a low enough level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. So this is the main objective of it. The treaty, as originally framed, set no mandatory limits for the greenhouse gas emissions for the individual nations and contained no enforcement provisions. It is therefore considered legally non-binding, opposite to what we discussed for Kigali Agreement. Then another outcome was Agenda 21. Now Agenda 21 is a comprehensive blueprint of actions to be taken globally, nationally and locally by organizations of the US government and major groups in every area in which human affects the environment. The number 21 was given because it signifies 21st century. Then another one that we saw there was Convention on Biological Diversity. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is an international treaty that was adopted at the Earth Summit in 1992. It has 3 major goals: conservation of the biological diversity, then sustainable use of the components, and finally fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of genetic resources. So these 3 were the major goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So in other words, its objective is to develop national strategies for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Now, why this Convention of Biological Diversity is important is also because it was for the first time that in an international law, it was recognized that the conservation of biological diversity is a common concern of humankind and is an integral part of the development process. And that's why this recognition was so important that it became a very important tagline associated with the convention. Now, the agreement actually covers all the ecosystems, species and genetic resources. It links traditional conservation efforts to the economic goal of using biological resources sustainably. Another important point is the fact that it sets principles for the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. It also covers rapidly expanding field of biotechnology through Cartagena Protocol, which happened later in 2000, on biosafety, addressing the technology development and transfer, benefit sharing and biosafety issues. And most importantly, the last line, if you see, it is a legally binding document. The countries that join this are obliged to implement the provisions. So all these are important with respect to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or something called as CBD. Then in 1994 we had UN Convention on Desertification. Now back in 1992 during the Earth Summit, an intergovernmental negotiation committee for elaboration of an international convention to combat desertification in countries experiencing serious droughts or desertification was recommended, and this led to the convention. So the convention endorses and employs a bottom-up approach to international environmental cooperation. So what exactly is the aim? Aim for this convention is to tackle desertification through national, regional or sub-regional activities, India hosts a network on agroforestry and soil conservation. And back in 2006 was declared as the International Years of Desert and Desertification. So this is about this. The next important protocol is Kyoto Protocol, and from the examination point of view, one of the most important ones. So the countries that ratify this protocol commit to reducing their emissions of carbon dioxide and 5 other greenhouse gases. And what are they? Methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. So these 5 greenhouse gases apart from carbon dioxide have to be reduced under this protocol, and or the countries have to engage in emissions trading if they maintain or increase the emission of these gases. So under the protocol there were 2 categories that we had. One was Annex 1 countries and the second was non-Annex 1 countries. So Annex 1 countries among the developed nations, referred to as Annex 1 countries, who have accepted greenhouse gas emission reduction obligation and must submit an annual greenhouse gas inventory. Then apart from that, you had the other set of countries that were the countries among the developing nations or among the least developed nations, which were referred to as non-Annex 1 countries, who have no greenhouse gas emission reduction obligation but may participate in the clean development mechanism, or something called as CDM. So by 2008-2012, the Annex 1 countries had to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by average of 5% below their 1990 levels, and reduction targets finally expired in 2013. The Kyoto Protocol also included flexible mechanisms which allow the Annex 1 economies to meet their greenhouse gas targets by purchasing the greenhouse gas emission reductions from elsewhere. So this was something that was unique and provided under the Kyoto Protocol. So these can be bought either from financial exchanges or from projects which reduce emissions in non-Annex 1 economies under the clean development mechanism, or in other Annex 1 countries under the joint implementation. So only the CDM Executive Board accredited certified emission reductions can be bought and sold in this manner. Now one significant improvement that happened was the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol. So during the second commitment period, parties committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 18% below 1990 levels in the 8-year period from 2013 to 2020. Then the next one that we need to look at is the Rotterdam Convention. Now the objectives of the Rotterdam Conventions are: first, to promote shared responsibility and cooperative efforts among the parties in an international trade of certain hazardous chemicals in order to protect human health and the environment from potential harm. And second, to contribute to the environmentally sound use of these hazardous chemicals by facilitating information exchange about their characteristics by providing for a national decision-making process on their import and export by disseminating these decisions to the parties. So the convention created a legally binding obligation for the implementation of the prior informed consent. So the Rotterdam Convention was adopted in 1998 and finally it came into force in 2004. Then after that you had the very famous Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. Now the Cartagena Protocol is an international agreement which aims to ensure the safe handling, transport and use of living modified organisms resulting from modern biotechnology that may have adverse effect on biological diversity. It was adopted in January 2000 and entered into force in September 2003. So under the Cartagena Protocol, an advanced informed agreement was established for ensuring that countries are provided with the information necessary to make informed decisions before agreeing to the import of such organisms into their territory. And finally, the protocol also established a biosafety cleaning house to facilitate the exchange of information on living modified organisms and to assist countries in the implementation of the protocol. So just remember these 2 points, these are going to be important for the examination. Then after that you had another Stockholm Convention, that is on persistent organic pollutants or POPs in 2001, which came into force in 2004. Now what do we mean by a persistent organic pollutant or POP? First thing first, there are 12 POPs that are listed out, and these POPs are called as persistent organic pollutants because they are resistant to natural biodegradation that can happen. For example, DDT. Degradation of DDT is very, very difficult. So that's why it becomes a persistent organic pollutant. So in 1995, the Governing Council of the United Nations Environment Programme or UNEP called for global action to be taken on POPs, which defined it as chemical substances that persist in the environment, bioaccumulate through the food web, and pose a risk of causing adverse effect on human health and the environment. Then apart from that, the next one that we had was the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development 2002. This was again very significant declaration because it marked 10 years from 1992 Earth Summit. So it was adopted at the World Summit on Sustainable Development or WSSD, and sometimes it is also referred to as Earth Summit 2002 because the plan of implementation of the World Summit on Sustainable Development was agreed upon in this particular event. So the Johannesburg Declaration builds on earlier declarations made at the United Nations Conference on Human Environment or something called as Stockholm Declaration of 1972 and the Earth Summit that happened in 1992. So in terms of the political commitment of parties, the declaration is more general statement than the Rio Declaration, and this is one of the drawbacks of the Johannesburg Declaration. It is an agreement to focus particularly on the worldwide conditions that pose severe threats to the sustainable development of the people of the world. So the things that were said in the Johannesburg Declaration were not very specific, and that's why you will see that this is said to be one of the failures in the way the conferences have happened, because everything was very general. There were no specific targets that were put on countries, and that's why it is not said to be one of the greatest achievements of UN when it comes to the different conventions. Then after this we had something called as the Nagoya Protocol in 2010. So the Nagoya Protocol basically is an international agreement which aims at sharing the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources in a very fair and equitable way. This can happen by appropriate access to genetic resources and by appropriate transfer of relevant technologies, taking into account all rights over these resources to the technologies and by appropriating funding, thereby contributing to the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of the components. So it was adopted at the 10th CBD meeting that was held in Nagoya in 2010. That's why it is called as Nagoya Protocol. The fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources in one of the three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that's why the main focus here was that very thing. Then the strategic plans consisted of 20 new biodiversity targets for 2020, and these were named as Aichi biodiversity targets. Then the next one that we had was Rio Plus 20 or something, another Earth Summit that happened in Rio in the year 2012, and that's why it was named as Rio Plus 20. So by this conference, UN wanted to bring together governments, international institutions and major NGO groups to agree on a range of smart measures for all these activities like poverty reduction, clean energy, sustainable development. And even when you talk about the sustainable development, it considers three pillars: economic development, environmental protection, and social development. So all these things were listed out in the Rio Plus 20 conference. After that, we had the Minimata conference on mercury. Now, this is an international treaty designed to protect human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and release of mercury and mercury components. Now, why it was held at Minimata is because Minimata is symbolic or is of symbolic importance, as the city went through a devastating incident of mercury poisoning. And that's why after that a convention happened on mercury. So it is expected that over the next few decades this international agreement will enhance the reduction of mercury pollution from the targeted activities responsible for the major release of mercury into the immediate environment. Then we come to 2015, when the Paris Climate Summit happened, and most important one and the most recent one of significance. It provides for the post-Kyoto Protocol commitments to combat climate change, and the major outcomes, just remember these 2 points, the major outcomes. First of all, it commits 196 countries to work together to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above the industrial levels, with a stretch goal of keeping below 1.5 degree Celsius. So now, when we talk about the Paris Climate Summit, basically we are talking about going below the industrial levels, or you can say for the first time when the industrial revolution started. So the countries have to limit the warming to not more than 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, with a stretch goal of keeping it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Second, it also calls for stopping the rise of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. A few more things with respect to this. First, in 2018, the countries will take stock of their progress on meeting their pledges, and by 2020, they will have to produce a new INDC, or intended nationally determined contributions. Then, Paris Climate Summit is not a treaty, and the intended nationally determined contributions are not a binding document. But still, the deal contains some of the binding elements, such as requiring the countries to participate in a system for measuring their progress on achieving their goals. Then, the implementation of agreement by all member countries will together be evaluated every 5 years. Apart from that, finance will be provided to the poor nations to help them cut the emissions and cope with the effects of extreme weather. The countries affected by climate related disasters will gain urgent aid under Paris Climate Summit. And finally, on 5th of October 2016, the threshold for entry into the force of Paris Agreement was achieved. On 4th November 2016, it entered into force. And finally, the first session of the Conference of Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, happened in Marrakesh in Morocco back in 2017. So these are the most important treaties that we had to look after. All the things starting from the very beginning until 2017 we have discussed. So just make sure that you know the important points that we have discussed. The main objective of each of the protocols and each of the conferences and conventions that we have talked about, those are the things that they ask. For example, what is Kyoto Protocol related to? What is Cartagena Protocol related to? All these are the kinds of things that they can ask you directly in the prelims examination. And from mains point of view, what you need to do is an evaluation of all these conferences. For example, when we say Johannesburg conference is seen as a failure, why exactly is it seen as a failure? Then the Kigali agreement, a very welcome step that hydrofluorocarbons were also included in the list. So all these things, the positives and negative sides. For example, Paris Climate Summit not being a legally binding document. How does it make the life difficult for all the countries who are accepting the Paris Climate Summit. All these things have to be seen here. So try to look into all these aspects, and especially from prelims point of view, it's a very, very important chapter, although a very factual one. So go through all the notes, keep revising this portion so that you do not make any mistake at the examination.